Daughter-in-law's sacrifice, the untold story of care, love, and the truth that changed everything. The burden of care. Laura Mitchell never imagined her life would take this turn. In her early 30s, she had always dreamed of a peaceful, independent life. After her divorce from Jack, she had plans. Plans that included pursuing her career, perhaps moving into her own apartment, and embracing the freedom she had longed for in her marriage. But life had different plans for her. In the aftermath of Jack's departure, and with no family nearby to rely on, fate threw an unexpected curveball when her mother-in-law, Helen Mitchell, suffered a debilitating stroke. Laura, in a state of emotional turmoil and uncertainty, found herself once again connected to the woman who had once been the source of much pain. The decision to return to Helen's home and care for her was not one Laura took lightly. She had memories of the years when her marriage had crumbled, during which Helen, though never unkind, had never truly accepted Laura into the family. Still, there was no other choice. Laura knew that she had to step up, even if it meant facing her past. Helen's stroke had left her bedridden and dependent on others for even the simplest tasks. Laura's heart ached as she watched her once vibrant mother-in-law, who had been full of life and energy, reduced to a frail, silent figure. The house was eerily quiet now, filled only with the sound of the ticking clock and the occasional rustling of Helen's blankets. Laura quickly took on the role of caregiver, administering medications, helping her move, and ensuring that the house was in order. In the beginning, Laura thought she could manage the responsibilities. She would wake up early to make breakfast, assist Helen with her morning routine, and stay by her side throughout the day. But it didn't take long for Laura to feel the emotional and physical toll of caregiving. Her own life seemed to slip through her fingers as she spent all her energy on Helen. There were no moments for herself, no time to reflect, no space to heal from the scars of her failed marriage. As the days turned into weeks, Laura's world began to revolve solely around Helen. She was not just caring for her physically, she was also emotionally drained. Despite her best efforts, she found herself resenting the woman who had once been a distant figure in her life. Every morning, Laura had to remind herself why she was doing this. It was not out of obligation, but out of a deep sense of empathy. After all, this was the mother of her ex-husband, the woman who had raised Ethan, the son they both cared about deeply. In the quiet moments of the evening, when Helen would drift off to sleep, Laura would often sit alone in the dimly lit living room, her thoughts swirling. She remembered the early days of her marriage to Jack, when she had hoped that her bond with his family would grow stronger. Helen, however, had never fully accepted her. Laura often felt like an outsider, even though she had tried her best to fit in. Over time, the relationship between Laura and Jack had soured, and though she had left the marriage, the wounds of that time still lingered in the back of her mind. Caring for Helen meant facing those old wounds again. There was a bitterness that Laura couldn't shake. How could she be expected to care for the woman who had never supported her? How could she give her all to a mother-in-law who had silently judged her for years? Yet, every time Laura thought about leaving, she felt a pang of guilt. She could not abandon Helen, no matter how complicated their history was. The days blurred into each other, and soon, the weight of the responsibilities Laura carried felt unbearable. She had little time for her friends, little time for herself, and her dreams for the future seemed distant. Sarah Turner, her best friend, had tried to encourage Laura to take breaks, to not let herself burn out. But Laura ignored her advice, thinking that the sacrifices she made were simply part of being a good person, part of honoring the commitment she had made. One day, after another long shift of caring for Helen, Laura returned home to find that she had missed a call from her son, Ethan. His voice on the voicemail was distant, and he mentioned something about needing to talk. He had been avoiding her for weeks, ever since she had moved back in with Helen. Ethan was struggling with his own feelings about his grandmother's condition, but he wasn't the only one in pain. Ethan's emotional withdrawal was one of the hardest aspects of the situation for Laura. She had always been close to her son, but now, it felt like he was slipping further away with each passing day. She understood that his relationship with his grandmother was complex, but it hurt her deeply to see him so distant. She had always wanted to be there for him, but it seemed that now, there was nothing she could do to reach him. As weeks turned into months, something began to shift. Despite the bitterness Laura felt towards Helen, something inside her began to soften. She had seen the fragility of life before, had seen the toll that illness could take on a person. Slowly, she began to accept that this situation wasn't just about Helen or Jack. It was about Laura herself, about her own serious growth, about what it meant to truly care for someone, even when the relationship was imperfect. In those moments when Helen was alert, When she could still hold a conversation, Laura began to open up to her in ways she never had before. They spoke about the past, about the mistakes they had both made, and about the pain they had each suffered. Helen, though unable to speak much due to her condition, often looked at Laura with a deep, unspoken understanding in her eyes. It was as if, in those moments, they had both found a common ground, an unspoken agreement to make peace with the past and to move forward, no matter how difficult it was. For Laura, it was a slow, painful process. She was learning to forgive, learning that sometimes forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past. It was about moving forward, about not letting past hurt define her present. And slowly, as the days wore on, she realized that taking care of Helen was not just about fulfilling an obligation. It was about love, the kind of love that transcends old hurts, old grudges, and old wounds, hidden struggles. As the months stretched on, Laura found herself caught in a suffocating cycle of caregiving. Each day felt like an endless repetition of the last. Mornings spent preparing meals, administering medication, and assisting Helen with everything from getting dressed to simply moving her from the bed to the couch. The physical toll was exhausting, but it was the emotional strain that began to gnaw at her, wearing her down from the inside. Her world had shrunk down to this single role, caregiver. Laura had never imagined her life would take this turn. Yet here she was, putting all of her energy into caring for a woman who had once judged her, the woman who had never fully accepted her into the family. And although Helen's stroke had made her physically vulnerable, the emotional distance between them had not disappeared. Every day, Laura felt the weight of those old resentments she hadn't fully processed in the past. But now, with every interaction, they bubbled to the surface. There was no time for Laura to focus on her own needs, no space for her to grieve the lost potential of her life. She had set aside her own dreams, her hopes of finding a new career, and even the chance to heal from the scars of her past marriage. The only thing that seemed to matter now was Helen, and yet despite all her sacrifices, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was simply existing, not living. Despite her best efforts to keep her life moving forward, Laura began to feel trapped in. She couldn't recall the last time she had enjoyed something just for herself. Whether it was a quiet walk in the park, a dinner out with friends, or even a peaceful moment to reflect. All of these simple pleasures had become distant memories. She spent her days thinking about Helen's needs, constantly prioritizing them over her own. Laura had once been an independent woman capable of making decisions for herself, but now, the weight of selflessness had taken root in her heart, and she was constantly battling to keep her own sense of identity intact. Her best friend, Sarah, had noticed the change. In the early days of the caregiving, Sarah had been a constant source of support, calling, checking in, and offering a shoulder to lean on. She would bring meals, run errands, and encourage Laura to take breaks. But as time wore on, even Sarah began to notice how much Laura had changed. The spark of life that had once burned brightly in her eyes seemed to have dimmed. "Laura, you need to take care of yourself," Sarah would say every time they spoke, concern deep in her voice. But Laura only smiled faintly, unable to admit the depth of her frustration. She had told Sarah countless times that she was fine, that she was doing what needed to be done. But inside, a storm was brewing. There were days when she resented Helen for being so dependent, days when Laura wished she could just walk away from the responsibility and reclaim the freedom she had lost. But Laura didn't know how to walk away. She couldn't. The guilt of abandoning Helen even for a moment was suffocating. And so she pressed on, despite the constant emotional weight bearing down on her shoulders. One of the hardest parts of caregiving, Laura realized, was the complete lack of acknowledgement. Helen was physically present, but emotionally distant. Her stroke had stolen so much from her, not just her ability to walk, but her ability to fully communicate. The once vibrant woman who had been a sharp, opinionated figure was now reduced to a mere shadow of herself. Laura would often sit by Helen's bedside, talking to her in soft tones, telling her about her day, about the small things that still brought her joy. But it felt like she was speaking to a void, as if Helen was no longer fully there. The lack of response, the absence of warmth or even recognition, made Laura question why she was sacrificing so much. Was it for Helen? Was it for the memory of the woman she had once hoped to connect with? Or was it just because she didn't know how to stop? On the days when Helen seemed to be more aware, she would sometimes try to speak, but the words would slur or get caught in her throat. The frustration was palpable in her eyes, and Laura couldn't help but feel the sting of it. She couldn't communicate with the woman who had been her mother-in-law for so many years. There was no way to bridge the gap between them. The silence between them grew longer and more unbearable. Laura's resentment began to grow quietly in the background, like a constant hum that she couldn't ignore. She was resentful of the life she had lost. She resented the years she had spent with Jack, the years that had seemed promising but had ultimately led to disappointment. She resented the fact that Helen, despite her stroke, still seemed to hold the power, still seemed to be the one at the center of everything. She felt like a servant in her own life, constantly at the beck and call of a woman who had never truly accepted her. But there was no escape, no way to turn back the clock and reclaim what she had lost. The responsibility of caring for Helen became all-consuming. As weeks turned into months, Laura's identity as a caregiver became more defined, but the person she once was seemed to fade further into the background. She no longer recognized herself. The woman who had once laughed easily, who had enjoyed her independence and her sense of self, was slipping away. The idea of self-care had become a foreign concept, a luxury she couldn't afford. Sarah continued to check in, to try to pull Laura out of the rut she had fallen into. But even she could see that Laura was spiraling. One evening, Sarah arrived at Laura's house unannounced, her eyes filled with concern as she took in the scene before her. "You look exhausted," Sarah said gently, her tone filled with empathy. "I'm fine," Laura replied, her voice tight. But Sarah wasn't fooled. She could see the weariness in Laura's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. She reached out, gently placing her hand on Laura's arm. "You have to stop pretending you're fine, Laura. You can't keep running on empty." The words stung more than Laura expected. She looked at Sarah, at the kindness in her friend's eyes, and for the first time in a long while, tears sprang to her eyes. "I don't know how to stop," Laura whispered. "I don't know how to walk away." Sarah's expression softened, and she pulled Laura into a hug. "You don't have to walk away, but you do need to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup." It was a sobering moment for Laura. She knew that Sarah was right. She had spent so long focusing on the needs of others, her ex-husband, her son, and now Helen, that she had neglected her own. The years of emotional neglect had built up, and now the weight of it was suffocating. Laura realized that she was not just caring for Helen out of duty, but out of a need to prove something to herself. She wanted to show that she could be the person who didn't walk away even when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. She wanted to prove that she could rise above the difficult past and make a difference in someone's life. But in doing so, she had neglected her own needs, and now she was paying the price. She was stuck in a cycle of self-sacrifice, and the toll it was taking on her was becoming too much to bear. There was a part of her that longed for escape, longed to reclaim her life, to focus on her own dreams and aspirations. But there was also a part of her that felt guilty for wanting that. Helen needed her, and Laura couldn't bear the thought of leaving her in this fragile state. The struggle between selflessness and self-preservation was becoming more intense with each passing day. Laura's emotional strength was being tested in ways she never thought possible. As the months dragged on, she began to realize that she could not continue living like this. She had to make a choice between caring for herself and continuing to care for Helen. But what was the right choice? And could she live with the consequences? The weight of unspoken words. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the house felt a bit too still, too empty, despite the presence of someone else in the room. Laura had just finished tucking Helen into bed and made her way to the small living room to finally take a breath. The weight of the day, of weeks and months that had passed in a blur, seemed to press harder tonight. The endless cycle of caregiving was draining her in ways she never expected. She hadn't had a moment to herself in weeks, or was it months now? The days seemed to stretch together into an endless fog. As she passed the hallway leading to the stairs, Laura's ears caught a fragment of a conversation, quiet voices too muffled at first for her to make out. She froze, instinctively halting in her tracks. The voices became clearer, and she could distinctly hear Jack's voice, deep and familiar, tinged with the lightheartedness of someone completely unaware of the gravity of his words. "You're still up for the trip next weekend?" Jack asked. "Of course, you know I've been looking forward to it," came the voice of a woman, sweet, almost too sweet for comfort. Laura didn't need to know who it was. She knew the tone. She knew it well. It was the kind of voice Jack had always preferred, carefree, unburdened, ready to escape from the weight of life. Laura stood motionless, her back against the wall, heart pounding, a sudden tightness filling her chest. She knew what was coming next. She had heard the pattern of Jack's detachment before, had lived it for years, and yet each time it stung just as much. She wasn't prepared for the way hearing his indifference tonight hit her. He wasn't just talking about a trip, though. He was talking about his life, his freedom, the life she had once hoped they'd build together. "You're still coming, right?" the woman asked again, as if there was no weight behind her words, no burden of responsibility. Jack sighed, a sound that echoed down the hall, mocking in its lack of any real remorse. "Yeah, I mean, why not? Mom's still in her room. She won't even notice we're gone." Laura's breath hitched. The coldness in Jack's voice, the nonchalance with which he spoke about his mother, her own mother-in-law, took her back to all those times when Jack had acted as though everything was her responsibility. The times when he ignored their son Ethan's needs or turned a blind eye to her struggles, her pain. How had she not seen it? Had she always been this blind to Jack's selfishness? Was this how their marriage had always been, one-sided? As the conversation between Jack and his new girlfriend continued, Laura couldn't listen any longer. The words spoken with such ease seemed to pierce her heart in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. She could still hear his words ringing in her ears, each one a sharp reminder of the years she had wasted trying to make a family with a man who was never really there. She turned and walked down the hall, her feet moving on autopilot, each step heavier than the last. Her heart was a complicated mix of fury and sorrow, neither emotion able to be more dominant than the other. When she reached the living room, she collapsed into the worn armchair by the window, the soft light of the street lamp outside casting a pale glow over her face. Her mind raced back to the day Jack had left her, how she had been so willing to believe that everything would get better if they could just make things work, if they could just keep fighting through the hard times. But Jack had never been the kind of man who fought for anything. He had walked away when things got hard, leaving her to shoulder it all. Now she was stuck in this role she hadn't chosen, caring for the woman who had once treated her like an outsider. It was unfair. It felt like she was living someone else's life, the one she had tried so hard to build, and now shattered beyond repair. Jack was off living his life, free from the mess he had created. And here she was, alone with the weight of the world on her shoulders. Tears blurred her vision, but she wiped them away quickly, angry at herself for letting her guard down. She couldn't afford to feel sorry for herself. Not now, not when Helen needed her. But the bitterness inside her, the growing resentment, made it impossible to keep her emotions at bay. She had sacrificed so much for this family, sacrificed her youth, her dreams, her very sense of self. And for what? To be stuck in this endless loop of caregiving while Jack enjoyed the freedom to move on. The thoughts swirled in her head like a storm, growing more intense with each passing minute. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going like this. She didn't know how long she could continue sacrificing her own life for someone else, and yet, as much as she hated the position she was in, there was a part of her that couldn't walk away. There was still love, somewhere deep down, for the woman who had once been so kind to her in the beginning, and for Ethan, her son, who needed both of his grandmothers. But the cost of this love, of this responsibility, was starting to feel too much for one person to bear alone. This moment, this revelation, would change everything for Laura. The bitterness was just the beginning of a much deeper internal battle, one that would force her to confront her past, her marriage, and the choices she had made. She couldn't keep carrying this burden by herself, could she? She needed to find a way to move forward, to find her own happiness again. But would she ever have the courage to do so? A shift in perspective. It had been one of those mornings, the kind where everything felt heavy, like the weight of the world had found its way onto Laura's shoulders and there was no escaping it. She had just finished feeding Helen, making sure her mother-in-law had taken her medication and tucked her in before the sun had fully risen. But no matter how much she tried, the tiredness that had been building over the past months seemed to linger in her bones, draining her of every ounce of energy. Laura paused at the kitchen sink, staring at the dirty dishes in front of her, as if they too were a reflection of her life, piled high with the responsibility and expectations placed on her. She felt suffocated. She had always been a woman who prided herself on independence, yet now, it seemed like she was trapped in a never-ending cycle of caring for someone else, putting her own needs and desires on the back burner. With a deep sigh, she wiped her hands on a towel, deciding that it was time to leave the house for a while. She needed to get away, even if just for a few minutes, to clear her head. She grabbed her coat and stepped out the door, leaving the weight of the house behind. The cold air hit her face as she walked down the familiar streets toward the park. The trees were bare, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Laura's boots crunched on the frosty ground, and with each step she felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't running away, but just for a brief moment she could escape her responsibilities. The park was quieted, save for the occasional sound of birds chirping in the distance. It was peaceful. She sat on a bench, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth and closed her eyes, letting the calm wash over her. But as she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. Looking up, she saw Dr. Michael Foster, Helen's doctor, walking toward her with his medical bag in hand. His presence immediately brought a sense of familiarity, as he had been the one to care for Helen through her stroke recovery. "Morning, Laura," he greeted, offering her a gentle smile. "Morning, Dr. Foster," Laura replied, managing a small smile in return. There was something about him that made her feel seen, like he wasn't just another doctor trying to get through his day. He always had a way of making her feel like her feelings mattered, even in the midst of all the chaos. "I was just about to check on Helen," he says took us and said, adjusting the bag on his shoulder. "How's she doing today?" "She's okay," Laura said, though her voice lacked the usual confidence she had when talking about Helen's condition. "It's the same every day, really. It's like I'm stuck in a loop trying to balance everything, and I'm not sure how much more I can give." Dr. Foster nodded knowingly, his expression softening. "I can only imagine how exhausting it must be for you, Laura. It's never easy to care for someone, especially when it feels like the weight is all on you." And Laura sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know, I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this. I've been so focused on caring for Helen, and I've neglected everything else. My own life, my own happiness, everything's on hold." She paused, the words tumbling out faster than she had intended. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Dr. Foster. I've become so selfless. I don't remember the last time I did something for me, and now I'm just resentful. I hate feeling this way, but I can't stop it." Dr. Foster leaned against the bench, his hands in his pockets, taking a moment before responding. "It's completely normal to feel overwhelmed, Laura. You're carrying an incredible load. But you need to remember something. You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't take care of anyone if you don't take care of yourself first." Laura glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "You have to set boundaries, Laura," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You have to allow yourself to take breaks, to say no when you need to. It's okay to prioritize your own well-being. I know it feels selfish, but it's not. It's necessary. Otherwise, you'll burn out, and you won't be able to help anyone, least of all Helen." The words hit Laura harder than she expected. She had spent so long thinking that caring for Helen, sacrificing her own happiness for someone else, was the only way to show love. But Dr. Foster's advice was different. It wasn't about abandoning Helen. It was about creating space for herself, finding a way to heal and recharge so she could continue giving. "But how do I do that?" Laura asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. "I don't know where to start. You start by acknowledging that you deserve to be happy." Dr. Foster said gently, his eyes meeting hers with sincerity. "You deserve love, Laura. You've been through so much. It's time to start thinking about what you need, not just what others need from you. You are allowed to live a full life, even in the midst of caring for someone else." Laura sat there for a long moment, letting his words sink in. She had always been the caretaker, the one who put others first. But what if she could still do that, and still live for herself too? What if she could find a way to balance both? "I'll try," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll try to start caring for myself." Dr. Foster smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for. It won't be easy, but it's a start, and I'm here to help, Laura. You're not alone in this." As he walked away, heading toward Helen's house to check on her, Laura stayed on the bench, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She had so many emotions swirling within her, but for the first time in a long while, there was a spark of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, a shift in perspective, a chance to reclaim the parts of herself that had been buried for so long. The crisp winter air felt fresher now, and Laura stood up, taking a deep breath as she glanced around the park. She didn't have all the answers, and there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt like she might be able to find her way forward. And maybe, just maybe, she could have a life that was about more than just sacrifice. The turning point. It had been a long few weeks since Laura's conversation with Dr. Foster, though the idea of setting boundaries and prioritizing herself seemed like a distant dream. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that something had to change. As she moved through the motions of daily caregiving, feeding Helen, managing her medication, and doing everything in between, Laura couldn't help but feel the ache of loneliness and isolation. But she was also starting to realize that perhaps there was more to life than just surviving. One evening, as she sat in the quiet of her home, Sarah called. "Laura, I'm hosting a small gathering next weekend." Sarah's voice crackled through the phone. "Just a few close friends, nothing too crazy. You should come. I think it'll be good for you. A little fun, a little escape." Laura hesitated. The thought of socializing, especially after months of putting her own life on hold, seemed like an impossible feat. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step back into the world beyond caregiving. "I'm not sure, Sarah," Laura started, her voice tinged with doubt. "Laura, I know things have been hard, but you deserve a night to just be yourself." Sarah insisted, her tone soft but firm. "You've been living for Helen for so long, come on. Let's take this opportunity to reconnect. You've got to take small steps, right? Don't worry, it'll be fun." The sincerity in Sarah's voice tugged at Laura's heart. She could hear the concern in her friend's words, but more than that, she could feel the love behind the invitation. It had been so long since Laura had done anything for herself. Maybe this could be the break she needed. "I'll come," Laura said quietly, her voice carrying a mix of nervousness and anticipation. "Thanks for inviting me, Sarah." The days leading up to the gathering were filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. As the event loomed closer, Laura wrestled with feelings of guilt. Was it wrong to leave Helen for a few hours? Would it be selfish of her to take a moment for herself? But deep down, she knew that she couldn't keep sacrificing everything. If she wanted to continue being the caregiver Helen needed, she had to start taking care of herself too. When the night of Sarah's gathering arrived, Laura found herself standing in front of her closet, unsure of what to wear. She hadn't had much reason to dress up lately, but she also didn't want to feel completely out of place. She settled on a simple, elegant black dress that she had worn to a wedding years ago, an old favorite that reminded her of a time when she felt more like herself. As she applied a bit of makeup, she noticed how the reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger, someone she hadn't seen in years. Laura realized just how long it had been since she had truly looked at herself, not as a caregiver or a daughter-in-law, but as a woman who had dreams, desires, and a future of her own. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage before heading out the door. The evening air was cool, and as Laura made her way to Sarah's house, she felt a small flutter of excitement in her chest. It was unfamiliar, but it was there, a reminder that she was still capable of experiencing joy. When she arrived at Sarah's, the sound of laughter and the soft hum of conversation greeted her. The house was warmly lit, and there was a cozy, inviting atmosphere in the air. It was just as Sarah had promised, an intimate gathering with familiar faces, good food, and plenty of conversation. As Laura stepped inside, Sarah greeted her with a big hug. "I'm so glad you made it," she said, pulling back to look at her friend with a proud smile. "You look great." "Thanks," Laura replied, her voice soft but warm. "It feels good to be here." The night unfolded slowly, and for the first time in a long while, Laura found herself laughing and engaging with old friends. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to loosen as she caught up with familiar faces and shared stories from the past. It was a reminder that life could still be simple and joyful, even amid all the challenges she had faced. As the evening wore on, Laura found herself in conversation with a man she hadn't seen in years. Adam. He had always been kind, someone Laura remembered fondly from a previous social circle. Their conversation began casually, but as they spoke, Laura began to feel something shift. Adam was easy to talk to, and there was a familiarity between them that made Laura feel comfortable. "So, how have you been?" Adam asked, his voice genuine. "I mean, it's been a while. You've been through a lot, right?" Laura hesitated. For a moment, she considered brushing off the question, but something about Adam's calm, kind demeanor made her want to share. Well, it's been tough," she admitted, her voice soft. "I'm caring for Helen now, my mother-in-law. She's had a stroke and can't move. It's a lot, and sometimes it feels like I'm losing myself in it." Adam listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "That sounds incredibly challenging," he said quietly. "But I have to say, you look amazing tonight. You've got this strength about you." Laura couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth spread through her. She hadn't felt seen in such a long time, especially not for who she was beyond caregiving. "Thanks," she replied, her voice softening. "I don't feel that way most days." "Well, you should," Adam said. "You've got a resilience that's hard to come by. It's inspiring." There was a brief silence between them, and in that moment, Laura felt a spark she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was subtle, like a gentle nudge in her heart, a reminder that she was more than just a caregiver. She was still a woman with desires, with potential, with a life yet to be lived. As the night continued, Laura and Adam shared more laughs and stories. For the first time in months, Laura felt a connection to someone outside of her caregiving role. There was something about Adam that made her feel seen, something that reminded her of her own worth. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something, a spark. A reminder that she wasn't alone in this world, that she could still find connection and perhaps, in time, a path back to her own happiness. As the night came to an end, Adam walked Laura to the door. "It was really good catching up," he said, his eyes warm with sincerity. "It was," Laura agreed, her smile genuine. "Thank you for talking to me. I didn't realize how much I needed this." And as she left Sarah's house that evening, Laura felt lighter, like she had just crossed an important threshold. She didn't have all the answers yet, and she still had a long road ahead. But she was starting to realize that caring for herself wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. And maybe, just maybe, there was a place in her life for love again. As Laura walked home, her thoughts buzzed with possibilities. There was still much to do, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps she could begin to reclaim the life she once dreamed of, breaking free. As the days turned into weeks, Laura's newfound connection with Adam began to bring light into her life, something she had longed for but hadn't realized she was missing. Their conversations were easy and natural, a stark contrast to the weight of her responsibilities at home. Adam, with his quiet understanding and gentle encouragement, became a source of support that Laura had not anticipated. She started to feel things she hadn't felt in years: excitement, anticipation, and the simple joy of being seen and appreciated by someone. Yet every time she shared a moment with Adam, Laura couldn't escape the shadow of guilt that loomed over her. How could she allow herself to enjoy life while Helen, her mother-in-law, remained bedridden, relying on her for every need? It felt selfish, as if by opening her heart to a new relationship, she was betraying the very person who had given her so much, both good and bad, throughout their shared history. The battle within Laura raged. How could she continue living for herself when her life had always been about others? The truth was that for years, Laura had lost herself in the act of caregiving. She had put aside her hopes, her dreams, and her desires, all in the name of duty. She'd grown accustomed to the idea that her role was to sacrifice everything for the sake of others. Now, with Adam's presence in her life, she began to question, what about me? Her breaking point came one evening when Helen's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. Laura had come home from work, feeling exhausted from the long hours at the office, only to find Helen in pain, struggling to breathe. Her hands shook as she rushed to call for help, her mind racing with the thought of what might happen next. After a lengthy hospital visit, it was confirmed that Helen's condition had deteriorated, and her doctor mentioned the need for long-term care, something Laura had avoided considering for so long. The guilt of making such a decision weighed heavily on her. Yet, as she looked at Helen's frail form in the hospital bed, Laura realized something that had been slowly creeping up inside her for months. She couldn't continue living this way. Helen's protests against moving into a care facility were immediate and loud. She clung to Laura, pleading with her to keep her at home. But Laura's resolve had started to harden. For the first time, she found herself thinking about her own life, her own needs, and the possibility of freedom, something she had nearly forgotten existed. Sitting in the sterile hospital room, her mind whirling, Laura asked herself the hardest question she had ever faced. What happens when I stop living for others? Was she allowed to care for herself too? She had always defined herself by her role as a caregiver, but the truth was that her own health, both mental and emotional, was beginning to suffer. She had spent years tending to the needs of others, but now it was time to put herself first. It wasn't an easy decision. The guilt that came with it was immense. Helen had always been a part of her life, even if their relationship had been strained. She remembered how at the beginning of her marriage to Jack, she had been treated as an outsider by Helen, who had never fully accepted her. But over the years, despite their differences, Laura had grown to care for Helen. Now, that connection seemed to demand a price too high to pay. After speaking with a counselor and receiving support from Sarah, her best friend, Laura finally made the decision to seek professional help for Helen. She arranged for Helen to be admitted to a long-term care facility where she could receive the 24/7 care she needed. Laura, for the first time in years, allowed herself to let go of the constant burden she had carried for so long. When she shared the news with Helen, the older woman was devastated. "You're going to send me away?" Helen's voice cracked, her eyes welling with tears. "I thought you loved me." Laura, her voice trembling, replied, "I do love you, but I can't continue this way. I can't keep sacrificing myself. You need more help than I can give you, and I need to take care of myself too." Please understand." The room fell silent, and for a long moment Laura could feel the weight of their shared history in the air between them. It was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, Laura felt as though she had a future that didn't revolve around caregiving. As she walked out of the hospital that day, Laura felt something shift inside her. It was as though a fog had lifted. She could breathe again. For the first time in ages, she could think about what she wanted, not just what others needed from her. She could love herself again in ways she hadn't allowed herself to do in so long. And so Laura's journey of breaking free from the chains of self-sacrifice had begun. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be guilt and there would be struggles. But for the first time in years, Laura was willing to put herself first. She was ready to embrace the possibility of living for herself, for Adam, and for the future she had nearly forgotten. Little did she know the path ahead would challenge her in ways she never imagined, forcing her to confront not only her past but also the deep-seated fears she had about love, independence, and family. But that was a story for another day. Reconciliation. The days following Helen's admission into the care facility were a mix of emotions for Laura. The sense of relief that had washed over her initially was slowly replaced by guilt, a feeling she could not easily shake off. As the weight of caregiving lifted, a void seemed to open up in its place. Laura had dedicated so much of her life to Helen that without that responsibility, she was left unsure of who she was beyond the role of a caregiver. She found herself in a space where she no longer had to put others first, but she was unsure how to fill that space with something meaningful for herself. The guilt was suffocating. Even though she knew it was the right decision to seek professional help for Helen, Laura couldn't help but feel as though she had abandoned her mother-in-law at a vulnerable time in her life. Despite Helen's resistance, Laura felt confident that she had done what was best for both of them. But guilt, especially when mixed with the complexities of their history, was not so easily dismissed. A week had passed since Helen was admitted to the facility when Laura decided to visit her. She arrived with a heart full of mixed emotions, nervousness, sadness, but also a quiet anticipation. She needed to know if the decision she had made had been the right one, not just for Helen, but for herself. She walked through the hallways of the facility, the sterile smell of antiseptic hanging in the air, and made her way to Helen's room. Helen was sitting in a chair by the window, her frail form looking even smaller in the sterile surroundings. The once vibrant woman who had held so much power in Laura's life now appeared fragile and weak, as though her age and health had caught up with her all at once. Her head lifted as Laura entered, and for a brief moment their eyes met in silence. "Hello, Laura," Helen said softly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and acceptance. Laura took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "How are you feeling, Helen?" Helen gave a faint shrug, her eyes looking away as if unsure of how to answer. "I'm getting used to it. This place. It's not home, but I'll survive." Laura felt a pang of sadness. She knew that Helen had never truly accepted this new reality, but there was nothing more she could do. Her own heartache had begun to heal, but it seemed that Helen's had only deepened in this new chapter of her life. Sitting down beside her mother-in-law, Laura hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Helen, I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how I took care of you for so long, and about our history. I think there are things we never really talked about, things that were left unsaid." Helen's eyes flickered to Laura's face, and for the first time there was a softness in them, a recognition of shared pain. "I've been thinking a lot about it too, Laura," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I think we both have a lot of regrets, and maybe we've both been too stubborn to say the things we needed to." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and raw. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, but it was different this time. It wasn't filled with the usual tension or resentment. It was a shared space of vulnerability, a place where both women could finally begin to confront the ghosts of their past. Laura broke the silence, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "Helen, I've carried so much anger toward you over the years. I've felt abandoned by you, by Jack. It was like you never accepted me, no matter how hard I tried. And when Jack left, I couldn't help but feel that it was somehow your fault too. You never stood up for me. You never stood up for our marriage, and that hurt. That hurt more than anything." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, her expression weary. "I know," she whispered. "I know, Laura. I've always known. I didn't know how to accept you. And when Jack left, I wasn't sure how to help either of you. I was scared. I was scared that if I showed any support for you, I would lose him too. And that's all I had left. Jack. I thought I was protecting him, but I wasn't. I should have been protecting you too." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she processed her mother-in-law's words. She had never expected this conversation, never imagined that Helen would openly admit her mistakes. But here in this quiet, sterile room, they were finally acknowledging their pain, their shared suffering. "You were never the problem, Helen," Laura said softly, but in a voice thick with emotion. "Jack was. He walked away when things got hard, and I was left to pick up the pieces. You never made things easier, but I also never gave you a chance to help me. I thought you didn't care, but maybe you just didn't know how." Helen looked at Laura, her eyes filled with regret and sorrow. "I didn't know how," she said quietly. "I never knew how to be the mother-in-law you needed. And I'm sorry. I am so sorry for all the pain I caused you." The words felt like a balm to Laura's broken heart. For the first time in years, she felt seen, heard, and understood. She had spent so long carrying the weight of her anger, the burden of unspoken words, that to hear Helen's apology felt like a release, like a door opening to something new. In that moment, Laura realized that the act of caregiving had never been about Helen. It had always been about her. Laura had clung to the idea of caring for others because she felt that it was the only way she could find peace within herself. But in doing so, she had neglected her own needs, her own happiness. She had allowed the resentment to fester because she hadn't allowed herself to truly heal. "I've been so focused on the past, Helen," Laura said, her voice softening. "But I don't want to live there anymore. I don't want to keep holding on to these old wounds. I want peace for both of us." Helen's expression softened. "I want that too, Laura. I want to make amends. I want you to find happiness. I want you to have your own life." It was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had anticipated, but both desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, their relationship began to shift. They started talking more, sharing moments of vulnerability, and slowly, they rebuilt the connection they had lost over the years. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Laura felt free from the burden of resentment, free from the need to please everyone else, and free to be herself. As Laura walked out of the care facility that day, she felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of unspoken words had been lifted, and in its place was a sense of peace, a sense of healing. She had found forgiveness, not just for Helen but for herself. For the first time, Laura knew that her happiness didn't depend on others. She could choose her own path, find her own peace, and rebuild the life she had always wanted. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something truly beautiful. New beginnings. As the months passed, Laura felt like she was finally breathing again. The weight that had crushed her for so long, the weight of guilt, regret, and emotional exhaustion, had slowly begun to lift. There was a newfound freedom in her life, but it wasn't a freedom she had to earn by abandoning someone else. It was a freedom she had granted herself. A freedom born out of the understanding that she could care for others without sacrificing her own well-being and happiness. Her relationship with Adam had blossomed into something real and beautiful. They had started dating casually, but as time went on, it became clear that their connection was deeper than either of them had initially anticipated. Adam, patient and understanding, never pressured Laura, never made her feel like she had to give up parts of herself for him. Instead, he made her feel seen, respected, and cherished. For the first time in years, Laura felt like she wasn't carrying the burden of someone else's needs alone. Their weekends together were filled with laughter, adventure, and quiet moments of connection. Adam didn't just give her joy. He reminded her what it felt like to be loved freely and fully. In his presence, she remembered who she was outside of caregiving, outside of the role of a wife and a mother. She was Laura Mitchell, a woman deserving of love, respect, and happiness. But the changes in Laura weren't just confined to her relationship with Adam. She had begun to reconnect with her passions and dreams, the ones that had been buried for so long. One of the most significant steps she took was returning to school. For years, she had put her education on hold, convinced that her role as a wife and mother was her primary purpose. But as she reflected on her life, she realized that there was more to her than just those roles. She had dreams, ambitions, and talents that she had abandoned for the sake of others. With the support of Adam and Sarah, who cheered her on every step of the way, Laura enrolled in a part-time program at the local community college. It wasn't easy, balancing school with her responsibilities as a mother and her visits to Helen, but Laura was determined. She had already proven to herself that she could be strong enough to care for others, but now she was proving that she could be strong enough to care for herself too. As she pored over textbooks and assignments late at night, Laura felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that she had long forgotten. The lessons she was learning weren't just academic, they were lessons in self-love and self-worth. With every paper she submitted, every exam she passed, Laura was taking back a piece of herself that she had sacrificed years ago. Helen, too, had become a part of this transformation. Though their relationship had been strained in the past, there was now an unspoken understanding between them. Their visits had become more comfortable, no longer filled with the tension of old wounds but marked by mutual respect. Helen had accepted the care facility, and though it wasn't the life she had envisioned, she understood why it was necessary for both her and Laura. In the time they spent together, they began to share more than just polite conversations. They spoke about their past, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of pain, but it was progress. Small, but meaningful. Every visit to the care facility was now a reminder of how far they had both come. Laura was no longer the woman who felt trapped by duty. She was free, but her freedom wasn't about escaping responsibility. It was about redefining her relationship with those responsibilities. She could still care for Helen, but she could do so on her terms, without losing herself in the process. Her bond with her son, Ethan, also flourished. While their relationship had been complicated in the past, it was slowly healing. Laura had made a conscious effort to be there for him, to show up as the mother he needed, not just as a caretaker, but as someone who understood and encouraged his growth. Ethan, too, was finding his way, and his respect for Laura had deepened as he saw the strength she had found in herself. Laura's life wasn't perfect. There were still days when doubt crept in, when guilt whispered in her ear, telling her that she wasn't doing enough, or that she was being selfish. But on those days, she had learned to silence that voice. She had learned that her needs were just as important as everyone else's, and that she deserved to have a life of her own, filled with love, purpose, and self-respect. One evening, as she sat with Adam at the small cafe they frequented, sipping coffee and laughing about their day, Laura realized that her journey had taken her farther than she ever expected. She was no longer the woman who had been consumed by guilt and sacrifice. She was Laura Mitchell, a woman who had rediscovered her strength, her independence, and her capacity for love. As Adam reached across the table to take her hand, Laura felt a wave of contentment wash over her. She had come a long way, from the woman who had felt abandoned and trapped to the woman who was now building a future she had always dreamed of with a love she had never thought possible. The life she had always hoped for was no longer a distant dream. It was her reality. And as she looked toward the future, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next.